The victim sustained significant head trauma. Her hair is basically caked in blood. This is a very violent murder.
It shocked everybody. She was a very successful doctor with a husband, with children. What happened? Who did it?
Who would want to harm her? We find out that our victim has a darker side.
An employee has been fired.
He has a significant criminal history. The victim's husband would bring some extra partners into the relationship. Are one of these sexual partners jealous of the victim? This is one of the most horrific crimes I've ever worked.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Bonita Springs is a peaceful beachfront community located in the southwest of sunny Florida.
Bonita Springs is a middle city between Fort Myers and Naples. It's right on the Gulf of Mexico. It's this beautiful, quiet, peaceful place. It's a paradise of palm trees, beautiful beaches.
It's a retirement area. It's a vacation area. It's someplace where you want to go and you feel safe with your family.
But late June 2015, there's a discovery of a local person who's been murdered.
911, what is your emergency?
I'm at a friend's house, and she's down on the floor.
We received a phone call through 911 dispatch, and he sounded very scared. He sounded upset.
Sheriff's deputies respond to the call. Lieutenant Michael Downs is in charge of the investigation.
When I arrive on the crime scene, as I enter the residence into the kitchen, I look to my left, and in between the refrigerator and the island cabinets, I can see the noticeably deceased remains of our victim. There appears to be a small folding wallet laying on the floor.
The victim is 46-year-old Dr. Teresa Sievers. She was the mother of 2 young girls and married to Mark Sievers.
Dr. Sievers was well known in her respective field, the holistic medicine. There were lots of articles about her, with her picture like on the cover of magazines. She was on her way to having her own TV show. She's very personable, very, very attractive. She wanted to help her.
Of a very prominent person. When I'm looking at the victim, I can see a large amount of blood. Her hair is basically caked in blood. So I would assume the victim sustained significant head trauma. And in the kitchen, I can see immediately on the floor a bloody hammer. I can see that there's hair wrapped around the hammer and evidence of blood.
Captain David Levitt also joins the high-profile case.
The way it appeared to me is that the killer repeatedly hit her in the head with a hammer until she was dead. This is a very brutal murder. Why would somebody do this?
To determine the motive, investigators take a closer look at the home itself.
As I'm looking at this scene, there's a couple things that are unique. Namely, I'm looking at the side garage door and there's pry marks on the door. It's a possibility that the perpetrator or perpetrators may have entered through the garage. It made me think that this could have been a robbery that went wrong. Maybe somebody broke into the house, maybe the victim came home early, interrupted them.
Captain Levitt looks for additional evidence that might support that theory.
I started to work my way through the garage, and I noticed that there was luggage that was left behind that appeared to be from the victim. And then I saw her purse nearby, but nothing seemed to be obviously missing.
Even Teresa's wallet was left in her kitchen.
The folding wallet on the floor is placed a little bit too perfectly. Looking at the cards, they appear to be thumbed up instead of pulled out. So the house is in disarray, but not a house that has recently been ransacked or something consistent with what we would call a routine burglary.
Detectives also find many untouched valuables in Teresa Sievers' home, including firearms, ammunition, and over $50,000 cash in a safe.
So it made me wonder, is this staged to look like a robbery that went wrong? Because if somebody really wanted to take property, there'd be things that are missing. This could be a planned, coordinated attack.
While it's still unclear why Teresa was killed, investigators believe they know how it happened.
The victim had started removing luggage from the vehicle. She leaves her luggage in the garage. The altercation definitely happened within the kitchen. The attacker moved in on her very quickly. And then, according to the medical examiner, the victim was struck at least 17 times.
It raises many questions for investigators. Why use this amount of excessive force?
And the extremism.
The injury to the victim was so significant, it appeared there was something more behind it. Some kind of emotion or some kind of drive to make sure, yes, she is absolutely dead.
So who did it?
We're trying to find any kind of evidence that could help explain who did this to her. We're collecting DNA. We're looking for fibers, especially on the victim's body and clothing that may have come from clothing that the killer may have been wearing. In addition, we collected the hammer because we're going to evaluate it for any kind of latent fingerprints that could maybe identify who held it.
Detectives notify the victim's husband, Mark Sievers, that his wife has been murdered.
When we first spoke to Mark Sievers, he was out of state, so we have to wait for him to fly back into town.
Mark was 1,300 miles north in Connecticut, visiting family. Teresa had been with him, but she had returned to Florida the day before she was murdered.
He was very upset, like almost anybody would be when they find out the news that their spouse has been killed. He wanted to know what happened, and we couldn't answer a lot of his questions because we still didn't have a good timeline.
To find the killer, detectives need to piece together the last 24 hours of the victim's life.
Her husband, Mark, said to me she came back to Bonita Springs, Florida, the night before in the late evening time, somewhere around 11 o'clock. She came back without her family because she was very dedicated to her job and knew she had to be up bright and early Monday morning to see her patients. Mark Sievers tells us that the victim texted him shortly after landing to let him know that she had landed safely and was continuing home. And that occurred at approximately 10:53 p.m. Based on the timeline that we're starting to build now, we can say that his wife was murdered somewhere in between June 28th in the late night hours to June 29th before 9 a.m. And we know this because we received the 911 call at approximately 9:30.
A call made by Dr. Sievers' neighbor, Dr. Botrytis.
Teresa's husband, Mark, was worried about his wife not showing up for work and wasn't answering her phone, and that was not like her. So he asked Dr. Botrytis to please go by the house to go check on her. We're very eager at this point to speak to Mr. Botrytis because he just wanted to be able to shed some kind of light on maybe he saw somebody leaving the residence, maybe he saw something suspicious.
I don't recall hearing anything, but I don't know for sure.
As we spoke with Dr. Botrytis, it occurred to all of us that this is one of our best suspects.
Killer is the person who places the call to 911. Maybe they want to insert themselves into the investigation to try and control the narrative or control information to protect themselves and conceal their identity as the killer.
But the question is, he is our suspect. Why did he do this? What is his motivation?
Sheriff's investigators in Lee County, Florida, suspect that the neighbor, Dr. Mark Botrytis, could be Dr. Teresa Sievers' killer.
Dr. Botrytis is a close friend of the victim, and it's not unheard of when a suspect who actually does kill someone takes the time to call 911 to report it to the police because they think they're clever enough to get away with it.
So very quickly, my detectives immediately interview him. He was completely compliant. He tells us everything that he knows.
When I took the first step in, I saw her leg floor. At first I saw, that she was trying to hang something and fell. And then I saw the big bash in the back of her skull. And I saw the hair was over, like on the light when you walk in the door.
While we're speaking with Dr. Petritus, he's visibly upset. His voice is elevated. He seems extremely concerned.
I screamed. I took one step further into the house, and I got scared. Called 911.
To investigators, Dr. Petritus' story sounds plausible.
So we're leaning more towards him being a witness than a suspect at this point in the investigation. Does that necessarily rule him out 100%? No. We're going to ask him for DNA swabs to check his clothing, to check his body for injuries and things of that nature. But we're deciding it's now time to start focusing in other avenues of the investigation.
News of Dr. Teresa Seaver's murder begins to spread throughout the close-knit community of Bonita Springs.
It shocked everybody. They don't know what happened. Nobody knows what happened. So their imagination, of course, is running wild. So there's an extreme pressure on the Lee County Sheriff's Office to crack the case.
My phone starts ringing from all different people in the community, asking what's going on. But the truth is, I don't know exactly what we're facing. But I know I have a killer that's on the loose, on the streets.
So the pressure definitely increased. But we don't really have a clue of who did this at all.
For leads, sheriff's investigators start with Dr. Seaver's family. Her husband Mark is flying back.
Here to me. This happened because we need to know some answers because we're just replaying all potential nightmares in our head right now.
Annie Lisa isn't just Teresa's sister. She was also Teresa's colleague at her clinic.
She informs us about the victim's medical practice and said that we may want to talk to a former employee that works there who she identified as Sandra.
Sandra was bad-mouthing Teresa. Now, you may not like your boss, but you don't bad-mouth them to patients that are coming in the doors, like Dr. Seavers. You know, she's a bitch.
And we find out that our victim has told Sandra to find a new job.
She said, Sandra, I just want to let you know, I've tried so hard, but I cannot take your energy anymore. Catches her in a lie. Catches in her lie. She said, I need you to look for another job because I need to move this practice in another direction. You can't have me hurt.
That's definitely a red flag because that could be a potential reason to murder somebody.
Disgruntled employees frequently make for strong initial persons of interest.
Maybe they feel that they've been treated unfairly. Maybe they hold a grudge. And all of this could potentially lead to somebody taking matters into their own hands to seek revenge.
Now, this is significant in the investigation. It could definitely be something, so we're definitely going to speak with Sandra.
Sandra agrees to come into the sheriff's office. She admits she didn't get along with Dr. Seavers.
Sandra's saying that the victim was sometimes hard to work with, that the victim did have what was described as a strong personality.
She was this very dedicated woman in her business, was very driven, very focused.
But Sandra and her colleagues saw a different side of Dr. Seavers in the office.
Dr. Seavers had a reputation in the office as being somebody who, when things didn't go quite her way, or if she was in an irritable mood, she would lash out at workers, at staff. And it was something that not anybody outside the office knew about.
While Sandra clashed with her boss at work, she says there's no way she would have harmed Dr. Seavers.
Sandra didn't really hold any ill will towards the victim. Sandra's telling us that she couldn't have done anything to the victim because she was home during the time of when we believe the offense had occurred. So now our alert level is starting to go down.
But not for long. Investigators discover that Sandra was close to another employee who had trouble with Dr. Seavers. Sandra's own husband, Frank.
And we find out that he was also fired shortly before all this had occurred.
Detectives had to wonder if Frank, the employee who'd been let go, had a motive. Maybe he was trying to seek revenge.
To kill our victim.
A day after Dr. Teresa Seavers is bludgeoned to death in her Florida home, Lee County Sheriff's investigators turn their focus to one of the doctor's ex-employees. Her former assistant manager, Frank.
Frank was working for the victim's was in medical practice for approximately 5 years and was fired shortly before the murder had occurred.
So, could this be the killer?
Did you have anything to do with this victim's death? Frank had an alibi saying that he was home with his wife at the time of the murder.
Frank also corrects investigators about something else. It wasn't Teresa Sievers who fired him. It was her husband, Mark Sievers.
We find out that Mark told Frank that basically they needed somebody with a little bit more experience medically.
But Frank knew Mark's wife, Dr. Sievers, was really behind the firing. Nothing in that clinic happened without Teresa Sievers say so.
He's saying that when dealing with the victim, it's either her way or the highway. And Frank is telling us that the victim would constantly berate and belittle her husband, Mark Sievers, not only personally, but in front of other people. It was definitely a surprise.
Sheriff's investigators press Frank for more details on how Teresa Sievers treated her husband.
Things would even get so petty as Frank recalling one time where the victim took issue with the way Mark Sievers took the garbage out. So Frank is painting a picture of what you'd call kind of a darker side of the victim.
And you realize very quickly this marriage has its issues. Their marriage has problems.
Investigators take a closer look at Mark Sievers.
We're going to have to talk to Mark Sievers about what this marriage was actually like.
Just back from Connecticut, the widowed husband and father appears distraught to investigators.
You've already been through a lot, so I just want to go slow with you, and I don't want to frustrate you. At this point in the investigation, he's not a suspect.
Mark's alibi is solid. He's in Connecticut at the time of Teresa's murder.
One of the things I asked Mark was, how is your personal life going with Teresa? Do you guys have problems?
We have good times and bad times. We have ups and downs. But we've always remained committed to each other.
Mark's telling me that sometimes he upsets the victim, but everything's good. And he was very upset.
Captain Levitt steps out of the room for a moment, but Mark Sievers keeps on talking.
Talking to Teresa, apologizing, if only I was home with you.
Sure here.
I could have prevented this. Just very dramatic things.
I'm gonna wake up with you in my arms.
I don't want to diminish how people grieve. It almost seemed like a dinner theater performance.
The captain returns to ask what can be a difficult question for a recent widower. Did he or Teresa have any extramarital affairs?
And Mark said to me, what do you mean by extramarital?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to put this together in my mind, and I'm just trying to
That's
piece
what we're
things
here
together
for.
because-
That's exactly what we're here for. So I could kind of tell that Mark was playing word games with me. So I asked Mark directly, are you guys swingers?
Yes.
So Mark started to tell me about how they would bring some extra partners into the relationship sometimes.
She can do anything she wants.
According to Mark, in addition to them mutually bringing another party into the relationship, he would also have his own romantic relationships with other women, and by his admission, would report these instances back to Teresa later.
Any one of these multiple lovers are potential suspects.
So do one of these sexual partners or somebody involved in this romantic relationship, are they now jealous of the victim? This could be a very explainable reason why the homicide occurred. So this seemed to be a viable lead to pursue.
Eager for investigators to identify possible suspects in his wife's murder, Mark hands them his phone.
Looking at the contents of Mark Sievers' phone, there is potentially multiple sexual partners, and this basically opens up the floodgates. We went from having a very limited scope to a ton of information to process.
Just as sheriff's investigators begin sifting through Mark's long list of lovers in Florida, they receive a random call from a police chief 1,100 miles north in Mount Vernon, Illinois.
And he tells us that he has an acquaintance that thinks she may have information pertaining to this case.
Florida investigators waste no time. They fly north for a face-to-face with the woman who claims to know something.
We meet with our witness, Rose. Rose seemed very sincere, seemed like a very honest person. But you can see there's that little bit of hesitation. She's not really sure she wants to speak with us.
There's a lot of fear. People may fear retaliation. If they come forward, would they be next? Could they be victimized in the same way? So it takes a big risk and tremendous courage, oftentimes in these cases.
And like any good person would do, Rose decided to give us a statement. Rose tells us a story about her friend Angie. And Angie is extremely upset because she's newlywed, and within the first 2 months of this new marriage, her husband has to take a last-minute trip to Florida, and he won't let her go along this trip. She can't even call him because he left his cell phone behind.
Angie's husband drove down at the end of June, the same time frame in which Dr. Sievers was murdered. But without a connection to the victim, a coincidental trip isn't enough to make Angie's husband a suspect.
So Rose says, well, on top of that, he's close family friends with your victim, Teresa. He actually helped set up their IT network for their business, and he's best friends with your victim's husband.
The man's name is Curtis Wainwright. He's an ex-con, living 40 minutes outside of St. Louis, Missouri.
Curtis Wainwright has multiple prior cases against him. He's on probation. So now we have a guy who's a suspect being in Florida during the weekend of the homicide, and he knew the victim, the pieces are starting to fall into place.
Weeks after the murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers in Florida, Lee County Sheriff's investigators head to Hillsborough, Missouri, in pursuit of the prime suspect, Curtis Wainwright.
We immediately responded to the area where Curtis Wainwright lives in Missouri and meet with the local law enforcement to make a plan to go see Mr. Wright in person. We want to see what Curtis Wright is about. We want to know what's in his house. And we find out that Curtis Wright may have a firearm within his residence. And Curtis Wright is not legally allowed to own a firearm.
Missouri authorities obtain a search warrant for Curtis Wright's residence.
Because he technically may have a firearm inside, we're using a special operations SWAT team to make entry into this house.
The building is secured without incident. And Curtis Wainwright is taken into custody, wearing just his shorts. Lee County investigators question him at the sheriff's office in Missouri. If Curtis did kill his former boss, law enforcement will need more than suspicion to charge him.
Police may be looking to see how does he respond to questions, what's his body language, and is he capable of this type of crime.
Do you understand why you're here? No. Idea. Okay.
As I'm speaking with Curtis Wainwright, he's being very cooperative with me. He's telling me a lot about his life and his history of how he knows Mark Sievers. His friendship with Mark Sievers goes back to middle school.
From 14 years old.
And Curtis tells us he does have a very close relationship with our victim. And then he also tells us that he does work on the medical practice's computers.
Captain Lebed asks Curtis if he was yet another disgruntled employee at Teresa Sievers' clinic.
No, I like Teresa. She was helping me, so I have no reason to wanted to hurt her.
Curtis tells us he had no issue with the victim, whether it was professional or personal. He said everything was fine and really didn't give any indication that he would want to hurt her.
But as the interview continues and Captain Lebed gathers more background, he's struck by something peculiar.
I realized that his physical appearance is similar to Mark Sievers.
They look almost identical. They both wear the same type of glasses. They shave the same way with the mustache goatee. Identical appearance to the point when you see them in pictures where Curtis Wainwright and Mark Sievers are at a wedding, you can't tell them apart.
We're thinking to ourselves, well, this is interesting.
It's more than just interesting. Given the suspect's identical look to the victim's husband, investigators now wonder if Curtis Wainwright was more than just an employee to the swinging couple.
You don't have any other stuff that you don't tell people about? Maybe there's a little bit of sexual activity with an open book.
But he doesn't give any kind of indication of any kind of romantic relationship or anything like that with our victim. He basically laid it out to just a very close family friend.
But if Curtis didn't harm Dr. Sievers as he claims, then where did he go for the 3 days he left from his home in Missouri?
We're asking him, did you go to Florida during these dates from the 27th to the 29th of June in 2015?
Were you ever in Florida that weekend? No.
Curtis told the detectives he was not in Florida at the time of Teresa's murder.
He said he has a slew of medical issues and that he was home. He had not even been down to Florida for approximately a year and a half.
If his story is true, it will mean another dead end in the investigation.
So now we need to think to ourselves, is Curtis lying to us? Or is Rose either lying to us or not 100% sure about what she told us?
Investigators find the answer from Curtis's own mother-in-law, and her proof is sitting right in Curtis's driveway.
She tells us something very interesting. Curtis rented a vehicle on June 26th, went to Florida, and returned on June 29th. Our victim was murdered during that time frame. And for us, this is a win, because now we have somebody firsthand who says, yes, there's a little bit more of a push to try and collect further evidence against Curtis Wright.
To confirm whether or not Curtis drove this vehicle to Florida, investigators need to look inside, especially at the odometer.
We obtained a warrant for the vehicle and ended up searching that car. In that car, very notably, was a Garmin GPS.
While there aren't enough miles on the car's odometer for a trip to Florida and back, Curtis's personal Garmin could hold the key to his whereabouts on the weekend Dr. Sievers was murdered.
And we were really hopeful that it was going to give us evidence that would further explain this case.
When we look at the GPS, everything's erased.
Even though we didn't find anything initially on the GPS, we were still hopeful that some of our digital forensics personnel would be able to find something on the device that wasn't readily accessible.
While forensic technicians attempt to recover Curtis's Garmin GPS data, investigators uncover something they didn't anticipate.
As we're evaluating the records for this car that we seized in the driveway for Curtis Wainwright, we found that there was also another car rented by him just before the homicide. There was not one rental car, but two.
Investigators aren't sure what it means, if anything.
Luckily for us, we're able to track this vehicle down. And we want to look at the mileage, because we want to see how far he traveled. Looking at the odometer usage on this rental vehicle, we learned that Curtis Wright traveled a total of 2,703 miles, which was consistent with a trip from his house in Hillsborough, Missouri, down to Springs, Florida, which is our murder scene, and then back to his hometown in Hillsborough, Missouri.
The rental car's mileage is strong evidence, but not nearly enough to press charges.
It's not a smoking gun, because now we know he put the mileage on the car, but we don't know where he went.
Investigators catch a break when technicians examining Curtis Wainwright's Garmin GPS recover erased data. It shows the exact route Curtis drove to Florida in his second rental car.
When we're looking at this GPS data, we can see that Curtis Wright actually typed in the victim's address in Bonita Springs, Florida, and we know this GPS started to follow that route.
Captain Levitt now knows Curtis Wainwright has been lying to him.
Are you ever going to tell the truth?
He had been in Florida around the time of Teresa's murder.
Curtis Wainwright had the opportunity to kill his former boss. But another question remains. What motivation might he have had to kill her? Curtis Wainwright is the prime suspect. GPS places him at Dr. Sievers' Florida home on the day of the murder. Then, investigators find another surprise saved inside his Garmin.
A personal email address was used to log into it. Fortunately for us, that personal address actually was a person's real name.
An unknown man, Jimmy Rogers.
They find out that Jimmy Ray Rogers was a convicted felon. He had been in federal prison for guns.
He actually met Curtis Wainwright while they were both at the same federal detention facility. Curtis Wainwright says to me, Jimmy Rogers frequently referred to himself as Jimmy the Hammer.
The whole thing about his nickname being Jimmy the hammer that Jimmy always carries with him.
Okay. That's interesting to us because Teresa. He was murdered with a hammer. We're thinking that Jimmy Rogers is now a potential player in helping Wayne facilitate this murder.
Investigators are able to track down Jimmy Rogers, and they bring him in for questioning.
We speak to Jimmy Ray Rogers, and he denies any involvement. He denies ever going to Florida. He says he does not know the victim, and he was not with Wayne Wright.
But investigators don't have to take the ex-con's word for it. Jimmy's live-in girlfriend, Taylor Showmaker, reaches out to law enforcement with her own story to tell.
She believes Jimmy has a critical part in this murder of Dr. Sievers.
Why is that?
Because he murdered somebody.
Who's he?
Jimmy Rogers.
His girlfriend, Taylor Showmaker, she had everything to lose, but she spoke with us. She told us that Jimmy Rogers had her dispose of evidence for him. Luckily for us, Ms. Showmaker said that she could take us to these alleged items that she disposed of for Jimmy Rogers. He had her throw out a blue jumpsuit.
With her help, police are able to retrieve the garment.
This is a huge piece of evidence that we recovered. He disposed of a suit that he wore potentially during the commission of a murder.
But unless Dr. Sievers' DNA is found on the jumpsuit, it's just Taylor's word against Jimmy's. Investigators need more to hold him. They turn to the GPS data from Curtis's trip to Florida.
So as we're processing all this GPS data, we're able to see they were both at a local Walmart down here near Bonita Springs, Florida.
Investigators screen video from the Walmart security cameras.
And wouldn't you know it, right on video walking in is Curtis Wayne Wright and Jimmy Ray Rogers. They buy trash bags, a black backpack, a lockpick set. Now these are items that you don't buy at a crime scene.
2 months after Dr. Teresa Sievers was killed in her home, Lee County Sheriff's investigators now have enough evidence to file charges against the murderous pair.
Now that they're taken into custody, we speak to them separately. Here's your chance to exonerate yourself.
Mr. Wright is present. Mr. Wright, can you identify yourself for the recording?
Curtis Wayne Wright.
He denied being inside the house and blamed Jimmy Rogers for murdering Teresa Sievers.
No, I wasn't there when she was being killed.
Eventually, I think it occurred to Curtis Wayne Wright that if he didn't tell the truth, that there would be no opportunity for him to maybe receive a lesser sentence. Curtis Wright said that he wanted to give us the details about what happened.
I picked up the hammer that was laying in the garage. I came in behind her. I hit her.
Curtis Wayne Wright finally admitted to striking the victim multiple times in the head, and then Jimmy Rogers took over.
Jimmy started hitting her over and over and over.
Investigators now know each man's part in killing Teresa Sievers. But one big question still remains.
It's still not clear why Curtis Wayne and Jimmy killed Teresa.
To find out, the team takes a closer look at Curtis Wayne Wright's phone records. One name pops out.
Mark Sievers, the victim's husband. Curtis Wainwright explained that he was solicited to do this murder by his best friend, Mark Sievers.
That in itself was a shock.
This was a huge breakthrough. We asked Curtis Wainwright, why? Why would Mark Sievers ask you to kill his wife?
He mentioned having problems.
Curtis Wainwright explained that they had a very troubled marriage, and Mark believed that the victim was getting ready to leave him, that she had a TV show that she was about to start producing, and Mark truly believed that when this took off, that he would be down and out without anything.
Mark called on his lifelong friend, Curtis Wainwright, to solve his problem.
Mark believed that by asking Curtis to kill the victim, Wainwright would easily be able to find somebody because of who he spent time with. And Jimmy Rogers got a fairly significant criminal past, some of which is violent.
I talked to Jimmy and found out that he wanted to do that.
Mark Sievers also promised to pay his friend once Teresa was dead.
Mark had a significant amount of life insurance on the victim, somewhere around $5.8 million. So
At this point in the investigation, we had significant information from Curtis Wainwright. We had very compelling testimonial evidence from Taylor Showmaker. We had the GPS information that showed them traveling down. We had significant cell phone text messages between Mark Sievers and Curtis Wainwright.
With all the pieces now in place, investigators can finally put together Teresa Sievers' final 24 hours.
On June 27th, Wayne picks up Jimmy in a rental car in Missouri, and they drive to Florida. On June 28th at 11:06 a.m., surveillance cameras at a local Walmart show Jimmy and Curtis buying several suspicious items.
On that same date, between 3 and 4 p.m., Mark Sievers drops his wife, our victim, off at the airport to fly home to Bonita Springs, Florida.
At 6:09 p.m. on June 28th, Curtis and Jimmy gain access to the Seaver home in Bonita Springs, using a passcode on the alarm that Mark had given them.
At 10:53, Mark Sievers hears from his wife, says she's landed safely, she's going to get something to eat, and is leaving the parking garage. At approximately 11 p.m., our two suspects are in the garage. The victim arrives home, pulls into the garage, and starts moving her luggage out. Wayne follows the victim into the house, grabs a hammer on his way in. As he's on his way in, he bumps the dog bowl, causing the victim to turn around.
And Curtis Wainwright began to strike her repeatedly. Shortly after, Jimmy Rogers took over and began to hit the victim again and again. At approximately 11:19 p.m., the victim was killed due to blunt force trauma.
Jimmy and Wayne take out her wallet, thumb through it, leave it on the floor.
They rummaged through the victim's luggage in the garage to further create that false narrative that this was a robbery gone wrong.
They create pry marks on the garage exterior door to make it look like somebody broke in. And on June 29th, Wayne and Jimmy drive back to Missouri.
At trial, Lee County Sheriff's investigators' work pays off.
In December of 2019, Jimmy Rogers was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
In February of 2020, Curtis Wainwright is found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison.
Teresa Sievers' husband, Mark, is also tried and convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder.
Was sentenced to death. This is one of the most horrific crimes I've ever worked. Not only because of the level of violence, but because of the level of trust that was violated between two people that call themselves family.